ladies and gentlemen, thank you and welcome to Getting to Hired on LinkedIn Live. This is the first live interview for LinkedIn Live and Getting to Hired. So thank you very much for joining us here on the live broadcast on LinkedIn and for the rebroadcast on YouTube. I am joined today by a fellow podcaster, who will now become an expert in video, and a fellow Canadian military veteran. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce to you Adam Kinakin. Adam, thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Hey, man. Thanks, man. I'm very excited to be here.
So, Adam, why don't you, to introduce to everybody here on LinkedIn, why don't you give us a quick 2-minute origin story as to who you are, your military experience, what you're up to today, and of course, when did you release and get out of the forces?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So I can probably keep it under 2 minutes. My military service started in 2009. Originally, I enlisted as an infantry officer. So I started as a regular force member, went to Montreal, did my training out there, then off to Gagetown in New Brunswick. Had a series of events that happened. I initially suffered a pretty serious back injury, went from Reg Force to reserves, and spent a lot of time in reserves. That's where I did most of my work. I got to do some specialty courses and training, got to lead some training for our unit and my platoon. And then I eventually ended up, again, re-injuring my back and finally releasing in 2015. So after that, I moved on to different things. I wouldn't say bigger and better things, but different things. And leading and culminating in the Tactical Breakdown podcast, which is what I'm doing right now. So thank you for having me on, man.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure. And why don't you tell us a little bit about the Tactical Breakdown podcast? What is that? How can people tune into it or catch it? And how is it helping not only you, but of course, military veterans out there?
Yeah, I appreciate you letting me bring that up. So the Tactical Breakdown podcast was something that I came up with when I was sitting at home. I was taking some time off between the birth of my my second and third child. I have 3 now, under 3, so that's fun. What actually ended up happening was I was sitting there. I kind of had that come to Jesus moment where I was like, "What am I doing? I want to set something up for my future that I enjoy, and not just something that kind of pays the bills." So the Tactical Breakdown podcast came about because I've always been a trainer and instructor. Started out in martial arts when I was a teenager, progressed to being a DT instructor, training security officers and things like that. And then in the military, being able to lead those training roles. So I've always loved teaching. I've always loved training. And if you ask my wife or anybody that knows me, they'll say one thing I do is talk way too much. So it was kind of a nice, it kind of blended well together, the whole podcast thing, because I can sit and talk for hours and nobody can tell me to be quiet. So I put the podcast together as a way for instructors and trainers across North America and across the world, specialists in law enforcement, military, first response, to share their knowledge and information, because as you know, sometimes government agencies are way too insular with their training. So it's hard for information in one agency to get to the other. It can take months, weeks, years. It can, and sometimes the information never gets there. So this is kind of a way to open the door, bridge the gap, so that an instructor in Toronto can sit down and speak with a SWAT team leader in Los Angeles, and get the most real-time, up-to-date information. So that was the purpose of the podcast. And it's kind of exploded, to be honest with you. I wasn't expecting such an amazing response from the listeners and from the guests that we've had on the show. And all that we're hearing back is people want more. They want more information that officers can take out onto the field with them and use in their day-to-day. So that's kind of the purpose of the Tactical Breakdown podcast.
Well, and so, I mean, the title talks about, of course, tactical breakdown, that speaks to or kind of gives you the image of use of force and execution and the right tactical deployment to be able to affect that use of force. But looking at the podcast itself, it's not just about the tactical play for the situation you're in. You talk about mental health and struggles and the hurdles that folks in the EMS community, policing, military, the struggles that we deal with overall, not just the actual skills of use of force, but rather, everything that comes with that as well.
That's absolutely right. It's really interesting. When I first decided to put this podcast together, my initial thought was, oh, it's going to be really cool. I'm going to sit down and speak to the best, SWAT leaders and tactical operators. And we're going to go really micro into like kicking down doors. And we transitioned very quickly into talking about mental health. And if you take an overview of what the platform is about, and the whole reason I put it together was so that people are safer. They have information that can help save their lives. Mental health is a huge component of that. And I didn't realize until I started doing this podcast and speaking with these experts that, as much as we would talk about the hand-to-hand stuff, the tactical movements and all those types of things, that was all fine and good. But everything kind of tied into the mental health of that officer. What happens after you respond to one of those calls? What happens after you have an officer involved shooting? What happens after a deployment and you lost 3 guys to an IED? Things that aren't spoken about, like it's being spoken about more. And these subjects are being put out into the news, into the media more often and more regularly, but not nearly enough. For example, we talk about line of duty deaths for law enforcement officers. And I think right now in the US, and forgive me if my numbers are wrong, but I believe it's at 102 or maybe 104 line of duty deaths. We've had twice that many officers take their own lives due to stress on the job. Those are numbers that don't go out. Those are numbers that nobody talks about. And if we're talking about, even just by the math alone, well, if twice as many are dying due to PTSD or some type of mental distress and they're not getting the help they need or the skills to cope with everything that happens on the job, then why aren't we spending our time there? Because twice as many are dying from the tactical mistakes that are happening. So it's a really interesting conversation, and we could go right down the rabbit hole and talk about it for hours, but it is a huge component of our show.
Absolutely. And let's dive into that in a way that relates to our military experience. You talked about you served in the infantry now, but you have some stories on how your military career kind of evolved, because you started off Rig Force and then something happened and that shifted right, and you had to adapt and overcome, and then of course that led to you eventually released from the military. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about and tell us a story about your non-typical journey when it comes to your military experience and how that led to your eventual release and the beginning of your transition.
Yeah, absolutely. So just like anybody, any young guy, I was 19 when I first joined, and in infantry. And the first thought in my head was, well, I want to go overseas and kick indoors like everybody else. So that was where my thought process went. That was what I was looking forward to. And so everything I did in my military career was kind of aimed at that one specific end goal. Now, what happened was, obviously in training, I ended up suffering an injury on a infantry, it was an Army officer training course. We were digging trenches in Gagetown in the middle of February with pickaxes. So the ground is frozen, yet we're still trying to dig trenches. It didn't go so well. I suffered a back injury, and one thing I don't really talk too often about is that 6-month period when I suffered that first injury, because that was the first time I realized, oh shit, am I even going to be able to get back into doing what I want to do? Or are they going to make me do something else? Compounded with that, with our MIR, I was in traction, I was in physio every single day. But they also put me on a shit ton of medication. I was on oxycodone. I was on a whole bunch of different drugs. And the problem with that was, now I was set with a problem where I had too much time on my hands and nothing to do with it. So on top of the medications they were giving me, I was also self-medicating with alcohol, which is all too readily found where we were. And it really delayed my progress to kind of get back into what I wanted to do. Now, eventually I ended up transitioning into the reserve force from the reg force, I released and rejoined because it was a quicker route to get back into the action. When I got back to my unit, I kind of restarted that training cycle. I was lucky that our unit in Saskatoon, the North Saskatchewan Regiment, is full of some amazing senior NCOs, some amazing leadership in our officer corps, and they all have amazing civilian jobs outside of work. Most of them in the law enforcement community, whether it was policing, corrections, things like that. But I had the opportunity to sit there and speak with them and talk about life outside of the military. Because I had gone reg forced, I was engulfed in green, essentially. There was no outside view. It was, you were inside the bubble, as we like to say, right?
And not only inside the bubble, but for those who have had the privilege of being and serving in Gagetown, you mentioned a lot of time on your hands, not a lot to do. Gagetown it's a little isolated, and there's not much to do at Gagetown other than, well, the things that you found yourself doing.
Yeah, exactly. Right. You'd either walk down to the pool hall or you're sitting in the mess, and that is a problem in itself. And we won't get into it here, but when I got into the reserves, it kind of opened up the door to me that, oh, there is another side to what it means to serve in the military. And I found a lot of satisfaction in what I was doing there. I got to do a lot of specialty training courses. I got to do things that normally I would never get the chance to do if I would have stayed as a Reg Force platoon commander. So that was really cool. And the other thing was I got to sit and speak with these people that worked outside of the military, that had lives and jobs and families outside of what the Canadian Forces had to offer. And that was kind of my first look into a potential transition. And that was the first time I was like, well, maybe I can do reserve and also be a civilian and do things on the side as well. So that was kind of my first transition. I ended up getting slotted onto a dismounted platoon commander course, and I ended up injuring my back kind of in a different spot, but way worse the second time. I fell into a tank rut with 100 pounds of gear on my back doing dismounted assaults. So it actually, I lost all feeling in my legs. I thought I was paralyzed. They medevaced me out. And it was an ugly couple months. But eventually feeling came back, everything came back. I was good to go. And they basically said, well, listen, obviously, combat arms isn't going to be the thing for you because of your medical status. So we're going to voluntarily transfer into a different trade. That was kind of the only option I had. So I decided not to do that. I decided I wanted to release and take my chances rehabbing and stuff like that. But the problem was I always in the back of my mind was like, I've always wanted to be in the military. I always wanted to deploy. Like I said, I joined wanting to go overseas. So I made the mistake of not being completely honest with our medical staff when it came to evaluations, how much my back had rehabbed, the pain and stuff like that I was feeling. And I kind of buried it. Yeah, I'm good to go. No problem. Sign off. I'll sign off whenever you want. And I had a regular voluntary release with no medical notes on my file. Now looking back at it was a major mistake because I'm still having constant issues like nerve damage and stuff like that with my back that now is not documented. So there's no way for me to kind of go back and fix that. But that
speaks to something that, you know, it's a mentality that many of us share in the military, in this sense of like, suck it up and carry on. You know, you need to be able to tough it out or get the job done. And in your case, you know, you wanted to leave that door open for you rejoining the military at some later point. And if you had been medically released, that would have been a door closed to you. But as your case, you know, clearly illustrates, it's important for us to be have a CYA mentality when it comes to our health, because in this case, for example, you suffered an injury, more than one, but you know, this particular injury ended your military career when it came to your back injury on that training exercise. And then because you did the thing that we all, from a peer group, like we all look to do that same thing, which is to not moan, not complain, just stand up and carry on. And you did that. And yet, unfortunately, that's biting you in the butt now because the medical process is not documented enough now to be able to support you with the complications of your injury as you get older. So it's, lesson learned for everybody out there that you really need to be cognizant or aware of the fact that when you do get hurt, you need to, fill out the paperwork, get the documentation, and be honest, because yes, we do just want to get back to the job and get back to work, but you got to take care of your body and take care of yourself, because, as we all eventually understand, we all become veterans at some point, because you're not in the military and, from the cradle to the grave. You're in the military and then you retire at some point and you've got a life after it. So important to look out for yourself and your health. But this starts to tie into your transition now, of course. So you've had this great experience in the reserve unit that you're part of. You've made these great connections with people who have 1 foot in and 1 foot out of military life, and you've kind of been thrust into this career change that you're going through. And so, how does that process start to manifest for you? What kind of hurdles and challenges do you see and do you come across as you start your transition?
Well, for me, it was kind of twofold. I've always been involved with martial arts and defensive tactics training. I was doing that before I joined the forces. And so for me, the natural transition was to kind of go back into that because I was very comfortable with it, especially security. So I've done when it comes to private security, I've kind of run the gamut. I've covered almost every position that you could imagine. I've worked it, whether it be close protection or working in healthcare, all types of things. So I've done it all. And I was like, I'm very comfortable in that zone. But when I left the military, because I had now had the taste of like being in a command role, where I had subordinates, I had people under me, and the training that we had taken, people may not realize this, but we have access to a lot of training when it comes to the Canadian Forces. There's no lack of training that they can give you. And a lot of it too is on the officer side, managerial in nature. And so I decided when I transitioned out that I was going to look for more managerial type roles. The problem is that it's very difficult to build a resume out to say, hey, I know how to manage your security company, never having that experience, but trying to translate what we did in the military to a civilian resume, which is super interesting to do. I actually had some help with a couple friends that had done it before, and they're like, you have to start looking at what is the exact, like, what does this look like in the civilian side of things? How do we phrase it in civilian terminology so it doesn't make us look like a douchebag on our resume, right? So.
Terminology and vocabulary. It's changing from military to civvy side, and we need to be able to understand that so that we can, be the dictionary for folks to be able to understand this means this and that means that. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So when you started that transition so one of the first hurdles you're describing, of course, is skills translation, understanding what skills you have that translate to a civvy role of some type and trying to put that on paper in the context of a resume. So when you went out there and started pounding the pavement, so to speak, when it came to looking for the next, your next career, your next occupation, what did you face in that, and how did you get help to get past that?
Well, the first thing I did, and this, because of what was drilled into us, I basically sat down and I wrote out courses of action. I wrote out different COAs. If this is, okay, if I do this, then what's the outcome of this? Or if I go this
planning process.
That's correct. So, that's one thing that the military gives you. It gives you the ability to analytically think through problems, and to try to take the emotion out of it. But I would say, as a caveat to that, that's also a weakness, is that we tend to remove emotion too much from decisions, especially transitioning into the civilian side of things. You have to find a balance, and that can be difficult for some people. I know it was difficult for me to do initially. And so I'd write out these courses of action. Okay, well, if I went, maybe I just want to be a trainer. If I did this, what skills that I took in the military, what are applicable? Okay, well, I'm an RSO. I got that training. Okay, well, I was training gas huts. I was the training officer for my unit. All this stuff becomes applicable. When we start talking about taking a more managerial role in, like, say, a civilian security firm, well, okay, now they want to know, like, what types, how many subordinates or how many staff were you responsible for? In what roles were they responsible? Have you, we start talking about putting things like RFPs and RFQs together, proposals for work. Those processes are very, very similar to, writing a set of orders out. And there's all these transitions that people don't realize in the military. Like, the military is like a microcosm of our society as a whole. So every role that exists outside of the military pretty much exists in the military. We just have different names and terms for everything. The work that you do is the same thing that somebody outside is doing. They just have a different title and a different role, but it's the same stuff. And we just use different terminology, like you were saying. So learning how to take what we would do, instead of saying, well, I had 30 subordinates or whatever in my platoon, I would say I was responsible for 30 staff, and maybe if we were doing training and an operating budget of 1.2 million, people don't realize even if you're a jack or a sergeant, the amount of money that you're responsible for on any given day at your unit during a training exercise is astronomical when it comes to a civilian workforce. We're given access to a lot of equipment and a lot of money, or a lot of stuff that's worth a lot of money. And that's stuff that the civilian workforce really, really looks for, is the responsibility that you have, and even as a junior role in the forces. So,
absolutely. Well, just the connecting the dots between what we did on a military side, even your MPRR, looking at all the training courses that you may or may not have taken, and then connecting that with civilian equivalencies, whether it's a specific QL5, QL6 qualification, what's the equivalent in Civvy Street, getting the whether it be a Red Seal or what have you, depending on your trade, but be able to connect those dots and get the right recognition for the training and skills that you've had, and or being able to translate that or tell that story on your resume so that people understand in their context what it was that you did. That's huge. So you talked about, for example, that integrity, that responsibility, that leadership that is so ingrained in us in the military. What other kind of aspects of your military life do you find, or your military experience, do you find adding value to your life professionally today, or even just helping you through, continuing your transition?
Well, the biggest thing would have to be the now ingrained ability to withstand just really shitty circumstances and kind of power through. So it's funny because I tell my wife all the time. She'll be like, this, like, for I don't want to get too personal, but to give you an example of how my last few months have went. So initially we moved out to Winnipeg in 2015 because my mother-in-law was diagnosed with liver cancer. So we were out here helping her, supporting her do that. In that time, from when we moved here, we had 3 children. Now, don't tell but they were obviously all unexpected. So that was interesting. 2 we had back-to-back, 9 months apart. So that's partially my fault. I know that.
It's a good surprise. It's a good surprise.
It is. Yeah. But in that time, my father was also diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And then just recently, it's all culminated in the last 2 months. So we had both her mother and my father pass away. In the last year, I ended up having an issue with work. I had to, there was an issue with work, but I was laid off essentially from what I was doing. And we can't get into it because there's NDAs, but essentially there was a whole bunch of financial stuff that came with that as well. So we got all this shit thrown onto us in one thing. And of course, people are sitting there like, how are you even functioning right now, right? We literally went from a funeral in Saskatoon to a week later, a funeral in Winnipeg, both for parents, and trying to juggle the 3 children in between.
Mm.
And everyone was like, well, how are you doing this? Like, why does it seem like you're handling this so well? And we're like, well, first off, we're not handling it well. Like, you don't see what's behind closed doors. But at the end of the day, I always joke to my wife. I said, well, listen, this isn't as bad as sitting in a trench full of water in the middle of February. So this I can handle. Cause like, you know what I mean? Like it seems like there was always something that you could track back to in training where it was like, this sucked so bad and I wanted to quit so bad. But because you had your brothers and sisters in arms with you, you didn't. And you always had them to lean on. So the biggest thing that I took from that is when I left the military, the biggest shock to the system is you don't have that camaraderie anymore. You don't have your fire team partner. You don't have your platoon. You don't have your company with you anymore. So where do you find that on the civilian side? You have to find it in your friends and your family. So I found my fire team partner in my wife. And I obviously have all my friends as a support system around me. And those are the people that I lean on to help me through, just like you would if you were on a deployment and you rely on those people that are in your unit. So
Do you find, and kind of a little bit of a sidetrack to the left here, like you say, when we leave the military, we leave our family, our military family. We lose that connection in many respects. But that support group that we have is so key to our success. So when you left and you physically moved as well, how did you find the challenge of in your new home? How did you find the challenge of making that, like creating that new support group, making new friends and so on? Because it's a very common story. You're in military training, you're injected into this atmosphere, this situation, and you have to make friends to survive. You make friends not only because you must, but I mean, you have this shared, trials and experience and hardships and so on, and it builds a bond that, lasts throughout your career. People you serve with, you'll stay connected with if you're still in the military in one way or another. So now that you're out and away from all those people, and you're missing all those common contact points, and you may not necessarily have them geographically near you to be able to help you or support you and so on, how do you find that you're able to replicate and make new friends? Do you find that easy? Do you find it like, is there a barrier there because your military kind of mannerisms, behavior kind of push people away? Or how do you find that experience?
Well, for me, I don't know if it's just my personality. I've never had a problem. I can literally walk into any room by myself and just start talking to people, making
That's
friends.
Awesome.
I don't have that filter or that switch in my brain that goes, this probably isn't a good idea. They probably think you're crazy. So I go up and I talk to people, right? That probably started when I was engaged. Like I said, when I had that 6 months off, because everybody I knew was still on course. So I would go out and start. I'd go down to the pool halls, talk to people. I'd go down to Freddie, go to the mall, go see movies by myself, right? Like, so I learned the independence there. But at the same time, I kind of honed in on when I moved out here by myself. Well, obviously with my wife, but I was always involved in sports, in martial arts. So, I joined a jiu-jitsu gym here. I do training and stuff like that here. And I'd have kind of that community already built into that. I wasn't able to stick up with it as much as I'd like to. So I was really never able to develop those really close relationships with people. But I would say that when you're moving to a new place and you're trying to establish new things, the first thing I did literally when we got here, I found out where we lived. And the next thing I did was I found out where the closest Legion was. And I went to the Legion and of course you got all the old guys sitting in there. And I've always found comfort. We always did a lot of work with the Legions in Saskatoon when I was there. So I always felt super comfortable in a Legion. And that was kind of the tie for me from the military service to the civilian side. Was I could go to the Legion, I could sit there, and you could talk to anybody. For the most part, people are friendly. You can sit there, you can watch a game, you can just chat somebody up. And I always felt comfort in that. So that's what I used when I first moved here. And then again, building out relationships and doing things that I used to do prior to my military service, whether it be sports or community involvement and things like that. So
re-engaging with kind of the life you had before the military, so to speak.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's been that particular subject. Like there was a recent post on LinkedIn talking. The gentleman who isn't a military vet, but he talked about he's an older gentleman, had no friends, and there was a quick video about that. And I saw that post and I saw that video, and I was quite inspired by it because it's really spoke to what we kind of described here, which is this thing where whether like a casualty of your military career because of postings and constantly moving, uprooting your family and so on. And of course, if you're not the one moving, then a lot of your friends are posted out and go to different places. That we have a circle of friends that it seems like it gets smaller and smaller and smaller over time. And then when you actually release, you lose connection with a lot of your military family and so on. And so being able to have the, like you described, that skill, that ability, that comfort level to be able to walk in and just talk to anybody, and socialize, whether it's with the old timers at the Legion, going to engage in other like sporting activities like a jiu-jitsu gym or what have you, and get along with folks. That is a skill that a lot of us perhaps take for granted, but not everybody has that. Not everybody is so comfortable and natural with being able to do that. And so I really have to commend you for being able to do that. And it's a great role model and example to be able to say, for us in transition, to build that network, to increase that social support network that you need, being able to go out and do that and engage in those activities is very, very important. But
yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay, I was just gonna say, yeah, I'm not gonna take any credit for my brain being screwed up and being able to do that. So, but when you do make a good point, is that not everybody has the ability to go and just make a friend or go up and speak to somebody. So what I would say, especially for members that are, leaving the forces, that have been, sometimes people have been in for 20, 30 years, depending, there is a comfort level in being around military members that it's just inherent, because you spend in one training cycle, you're going to spend more time with your section mates than you do your family. And they become family. So, and that's not, and from a psychological standpoint, that's not something that's easily erased, nor should it be. So when you're transitioning and you're moving out, like, I don't know about you, but I've never been to one unit where their mess is exclusive only to their unit members. Right. So I know for a fact, because I've done it myself, and other people that I know that have gotten out have done it themselves. If I feel like I still from time to time, I still get the bug where I'm like, could I go back in? I want to go back and do it. I'll go down to our local unit, one of the units. We have 17 wing here. We have some reserve military army units. I'll go down to the mess. I'll just go in, go to the officers' mess or whatever, and just stop in. They'll be like, "Oh, hey, what are you doing here?" I'm like, "You know what? I've been out for a while. I just wanted to stop in, say hi to a few people." Yeah, great. You sit down and they're like, "Where were you? What'd you do?" And then you kind of just, you automatically have that exposure again. And it kind of seems to take me to the next time. And that's for people that are having a hard time with that transition, there are resources available, right? You have MFRC, you got all these different things where you don't have to still be in uniform to be able to utilize those services. So they're there, and people need to know that you can use them, and it's not a bad thing to use them.
Absolutely. I mean, if you need to go back and kind of as a touching stone, go back to that comfort zone where you enjoyed like the camaraderie of the mess, talking about stories and seeing where people are and your friends who might still be in the unit and so on. Absolutely. So going forward now in your civilian life, with the success of the Tactical Breakdown podcast, where where do you see the values, your veteran experience, where do you see that kind of helping you and driving you forward?
Well, for me personally, it gives me a way to speak, like, because our podcast is specifically geared towards law enforcement and military. That experience that I had is you can't get it anywhere else. You know right away when you're sitting across the table and talking to somebody who's served and somebody who hasn't. And it's amazing because it's not just like, oh, you were in the Canadian Forces, oh, I was American. It's different. It's not. It's everybody's had the same experiences. It doesn't matter if you served, you served in Australia, you served anywhere in the Commonwealth, or you were American, German, whatever. It doesn't matter. Everybody has the same experiences. The military is very good at that, standardizing. And I got to take all of that information and knowledge and the way we speak to each other and the way we share information. And then I take it and it gives me the ability now to translate what's currently happening to a more civilian application. So for me, that's the biggest thing is I'm kind of the conduit of saying, okay, well, we talk about this in this context. How does that relate to a civilian workforce or to somebody who's listening to this that's never, maybe maybe somebody's listening to my podcast and they want to become or they want to get into the military, or they want to become a police officer, or they want to become a fire rescue paramedic. It's difficult for them to jump onto and listen to a show when we're taught and we're using slang and we're using, abbreviations and all these types of things, and nobody knows what the hell we're talking about.
TLA.
Now yeah, I'm now able to take that information and kind of, I want to say dumb it down, but break it down enough. Breakdown, right? Double entendre, name of the podcast. Break it down so that people can understand it at a more basic level.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of the, now don't get me wrong, in the military, we learn terminology is very important, and you have to use the right terminology and vocabulary in the right circumstance. And and a lot of times the abbreviation helps us with the brevity of our communication. But for those, like you say, for your podcast, who don't know that vocabulary, to be able to bridge the gap, to be able to be the translator, to be able to connect the dots for law enforcement folks who may not know the military specific terminology for that, and vice versa, and to create a mosaic where you can see the comparisons of the two, the similarities between them, and how perhaps someone who's in the police force might want to become a reservist or join the reg force. Or if you're in the reg force and a reservist, maybe you can see yourself in a career in some kind of law enforcement or EMS kind of environment. Absolutely. That kind of catalyst to be able to facilitate that kind of conversation, and that conversation is huge. So if viewers of this show are looking to be able to connect with your show and you, how can they do that?
Well, we decided to put everything out right onto our website. So one website, you can check everything out. It's thebreakdown.ca. So on there, all the podcasts are on there. You can also find on your favorite podcast app. Doesn't matter if you're a Apple user or an Android user. All the major podcast players have us on there. And on the website, we also have a resources page. So we have a page for members or anybody who's in crisis. If you need somebody to talk to, or you need some more information, or you just need to reach out, there's resources on our website, and that's thebreakdown.ca/help. But you can get everything right on the webpage there. So it's kind of a catch-all, the website, but you can find everything right on there.
Find your podcast, find your resources, and you can reach out and connect with Adam specifically on the contact tab on that page. Adam, thank you so much for joining us today on Getting to Hired. I really appreciate you sharing your story. I'm looking forward to the listeners of this show reaching out and listening to yours. Again, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a complete honor to be here, man. Thank you for having me.
So again, thank you everybody for joining us here on LinkedIn Live. You'll be able to see the rebroadcast of this on YouTube at Getting the Number 2 Hired. But if you joined us here on LinkedIn Live, thank you so much. Looking forward to hearing from you in the comments below. Are you experiencing military transition? Are you having some challenges with it? How does some of what Adam talked about relate to the experience that you're going through? And have you listened to the Tactical Breakdown podcast? Looking forward to hearing from you in the comments below. And from us here at Getting to Hired, thank you very much. See you in the next one.